Hello everyone, this is Lowman02. I was doing a quick deck tech here. This is a RecSur, it's a 100 card singleton deck. It is actually a relatively old deck that was quite prolific pre-2011, 2010 when WotC conducted a banning of one of the cards that gave the deck its name, which would be Survival of the Fittest. The deck at its heart is a mid-range deck that is capable of going over the top of mid-range or control decks and generally aggro decks by vast amounts of life gain, and the flexibility of its large tutor package, which you can see over here on the left-hand side. To start off the deck tech, I'll explain the mana base and some of the decisions I've made in it. Dryad Arbor. As we jump into tutors, you'll see Green Sun Zenith, which is always a powerful combination with the Arbor itself. Additionally, as we go down, you'll see that we have cards such as Gavany Township, Gaia's Cradle that combine very well with it. It's a relatively strong card. Ancient Tomb is more of a new option that I went with in this deck, specifically just for the fast mana, plus the selection that you have over the mana base. The additional colorless mana can be very applicable when you're getting to your higher end threats. As you go down, you'll see General Fixing, Bajuka Bog, worth minor note. This is a Living Death deck, or Living Death deck, and Recursion deck. Obviously, with Living Death, it is a parallel effect with your opponent. So Bajuka Bog gives you the flexibility with cards such as Primeval Titan and/or your Knight of the Reliquary, which are both viable land tutors, as well as the more newly printed Traverse the Ulvenwald to find cards such as that. As you continue down, Canopy Vista, newer print, but searchable and tutorable land, you'll see those used throughout the deck. Dark Depths and Thespian Stage, very common combo that you'll see specifically with Primeval Titan over in the tutor creature package this deck has available to it, because it finds both pieces of that combo very rapidly, and it can bring 26 power into play as soon as turn 3 or 4. Depending on possibly a natural order draw or an Eldritch Evolution draw. Moving down, you'll see cards like Gaia's Cradle. If you were to look at chopping cards from this, I would say Gaia's Cradle is generally the one you may look at chopping from it. It is a creature-based deck, as you can see. It has 41 with additional sideboard options, which we'll cover later in the deck tech. But I found generally in play testing and then play with this deck that it doesn't tend to dump a large volume of creatures onto the board or keep them on the board throughout the game. Gavany Township, great option for the later game. At some point, you and your opponent will both exhaust resources depending on how long the game goes. And your man lands, which are throughout the deck, all available man lands with the exception of the white-black 2/3 life linking land, are currently in this build right here. Going down, another interesting choice, Horizon Canopy. A little pricey, but it is nice in this deck to be able to get rid of lands. Like we talked about, Primeval Titan and the other land tutors allow you to get to a very high land count very early in the game. It almost plays like a ramp deck and a mid-range deck with the versatility of a combo deck simultaneously. So sometimes you just want to get rid of excess lands you have on the board to get to more relevant action. Caracas, really a must for any deck that plays white. This is a great utility land against a lot of decks in the format. You'll see fetch lands throughout. Murmuring Bosk, if you ever play Junk, or Abzan as it's called now, very powerful land, and actually you randomly do have the ability to get it out onto the board untapped with the Woodfall Primus at the very top end of your curve. Phyrexian Tower, this deck loves to recycle cards, and we'll kind of talk about the recursion package that I'm highlighting right now as we move into the main deck. It's very powerful in that aspect, and it's a good setup for Living Death. The one trap you do run into with it, however, is that at times it can disable your fixing in the earlier part of your curve if you're trying to play a mid-range game. Moving down, Wasteland and Tectonic Edge, 2 land removal options, always a great option to have available to you. You can get it with Prime Time, Traverse the Ulvenwald. You can even get it with your Knight of the Reliquary if you're looking for an earlier or mid-game beatdown. Urborg, crucial land. It's come up many times. When I last played this deck in Chainsaw Massacre PRE this last weekend, came up many times that it was valid to get this into play after I'd already gotten my Dark Depths Thespian Stage combo into play. And the way the curve often works out in the deck, you'll feel like you're one land short, and finding that on an attack, a follow-on attack with Prime Time or Primeval Titan, will enable you to activate that combo to put a 20/20 flying indestructible Merit Lage token into play much more easily. As you can see, more manlands. You have Treetop Village here. Thespian Stage is already noted. Stirring Wildwood. And really, that's about all we have to hit up on the mana base. Hissing Quagmire as well to complete out the manland package that's available. As far as the mana fixing at the low end of the curve, Deathrite Shaman, Noble Hierarch, thanks to Sensei Rob, used to be Avacyn's Pilgrim. Hierarch's definitely a better option. Elves of Deep Shadow, flexible card in this deck specifically, and then Birds of Paradise has been good since the very first printing of Magic the Gathering. A couple interesting options for the deck that don't per se fit on theme and may be questionable, and we'll hit up another one a little bit later on when we get into the Tutor package. Dromoka's Command, very flexible card. The option that you're really looking at the most on this is the enchantment destruction or sacrificing of an enchantment by the opponent. This is a very useful option on the card, but it can also play mid-range and trade and or put you up on the board against a mid-range opponent. When you're looking at playing against Azorius or any deck that may play Humility, which is pretty much the bane of this deck's existence, this is your main board option that you have against that and or a Moat. Bitter Blossom, great card against Moat. Also just really great against control. This is a card, though, that you could probably look to cut. If allowed, it would likely be Survival of the Fittest. Moving into some of the 2-drop creatures and really the mid-range part of your curve and kind of the ramp part of your curve. Not a lot of ETBs, or correction, enter the battlefield effects for these creatures, which we'll kind of hit up in the next column over. Sylvan Advocate, as we said, we play many manlands. We'll often find them in the later part of the game, after the attritions really occurred, and that's really all you have left as far as threats. Sylvan Advocate is great there. It's a low curve threat. It's not a bad draw late in the game, and it also benefits your manlands, obviously, with +2/+2. Sylvan Caryatid, great mana fixer. So as you'll see, the mana fixers at this part of the curve are really trying to play around your Blood Moons and your back to basics of the format. And not mentioned previously in the mana, but we do run 4 basics, 2 Forest, 1 Plains, and 1 Swamp, which are tutorable with a lot of our package on the far end of the cards as they're displayed right now. Wall of Roots, also great card. We do have Court of Calling, Convoke mechanic inside this deck, which it combines very well with, as well as Birthing Pod, which it combines very well with. Kazali Pride Mage, not enter the battlefield effect technically, but it gives us some low end. One, it's a great low end or mid range threat. It buffers up a 3 curve or a 4 curve creature to a much better threat in the mid game, merging into the late game. And it takes care of artifacts and enchantments, and it's just a generally versatile card since it's printing. Voice of Resurgence, not an ETB as well. However, the effect that it can have on games versus control or heavy counter magic decks is huge. It is obviously wrath-proofing as well, as this is a creature-based deck. And it really just enables versatility throughout the game. It's great to sacrifice to Birthing Pod, Eldritch Evolution, Natural Order, as we get into our tutor package, or Diabolic Intent, because you get a creature back out of it. Dustwatch Recruiter, this is another one I've been probably looking to cut. Really haven't found the time in the curve to really use it for searching. Have had benefit from it turning to a 3/3 and giving me the reduction in casting cost on higher end creatures. But generally just a great card. Going into the next column here, we have our enter this to the battlefield effects creatures that are really the heavy hitters and what allows this deck to fight the mid-range fight, but also transition into a combo fight that allows it to go much bigger than a lot of other decks out there. Shriekmaw, great creature. The fact that it dies upon casting and essentially acts as a spell is phenomenal. As we get into our recursion that we have with the graveyard, you can reuse a lot of your creatures as spells 3, maybe even 4 times before you're incapable of doing so. Siege Rhino, a great new add to the team since this deck was since this deck's been a thing with Survival of the Fittest. Obviously, not much is beating a 4/5 trample body for 4 mana with a 3 point life swing. Thragtusk, good against your mono red decks of the format. Also, good tool in mid range. It just shines in a lot of different matchups. Even great against control when you get Wrath, you get a 3/3. That's still a decent body. Aven Mind Sensor. This is really the hedge bet against decks that are doing similar things in the format. This is another Bane card for us to be facing as well, as we do have 25 tutor effects, not even including the fetch lands, which probably puts it about over 30. Bone Shredder, similar to Shriekmaw, it is a creature that acts essentially as a spell by destroying a non-black, non-artifact creature and then dying itself so that we can recur later. Reclamation Stage, 3 curve drop that enables us similar things as Kasali Pride Mage, a little bit less flexible, but there's not a lot of great 3s that do that. The next best would probably be something like Uktabi Orangutans, which will only hit artifacts for you. Corsair Crewfix, yeah, it's an enchantment. It dies to more removal, but this is a great body at 3 mana, 2/4, keeps you alive, and also provides you card advantage. Not an ETB per se, but I treat it as such with the flexibility it provides me on the top of my library. Kitchen Finks, again, a great tool against more aggressive decks inside the strategy. Great with Birthing Pod, Eldritch Evolution, Diabolic Intent, any of the sack tutors, really. Obstinate Baloth. This one right here actually had some intelligent debate with Sensei Rob on whether it should be a Luxodon Hierarch, which is also a forecast, same body 4/4, that gives you the capability to regenerate the team. I tend to like this option better, as the deck is primarily green-based, much more heavily green-based than it is black or white, which are really the enabling colors for the green creatures that are in it. And plus, it gives you something to do against an early Liliana or discard effects inside the format. Acidic Slime, another great flexible card. Much smaller body, but the 2/2, the death touch on this 2/2 is crucial, as it'll help keep you alive against much larger threats or keep them at bay while you do more powerful things. Restoration Angel, it rebuys any of your effects already on the board. It's been really an all-star, mostly with Primeval Titan. If you want to get a second activation out of it, you can attack into certain death with your Primeval Titan and then end up saving it to get an additional 2 lands out of an attack that would have, killed it, and then gives you an additional 6/6 body as a blocker, as you set up more powerful turns. Woodfall Primus, a little more questionable on this one. I have yet to find where I wanted a natural order into this. Typically, your first natural order target is always going to be the Primeval Titan, because like I was talking about, what it really brings into play is 26 power, evasive power, really, because you have 6/6 trampling power on the Primeval Titan's body, plus a flying indestructible 20/20 that you can pretty much make it your beck and call. So this one may be one worth looking at cutting and possibly going with a more low-end ETB threat inside the deck. But very powerful effect. And the idea really was to take care of those pesky planeswalkers, because you don't see a lot of capability to do that in here. And another option, really, before we move on along the curve, could be for that to include Vampire Hexmage, which has obvious implications for comboing out with Dark Depths. However, the double black is a challenge, and really the card itself, outside of its ability to do that and target planeswalkers to remove them from the battlefield is pretty limited for the casting cost and really the effect you get out of it. So I haven't played it here, but it is a viable option if you were looking to go along a more heavily invested deck into getting Dark Depths or Merit Lage into play. The next card we have here kind of sits in a category of its own. Grimflayer, really what it exists solely to do is to set up all of these recursive cards that are sitting next to it. The reason I include it in the deck without an ETB is because of the casting cost at 2 mana, and the very real ability for it to become a 4/4 very fast in this deck. So it's just a solid body. It can play mid-range. It can keep you alive, and it can really set up some broken things with your graveyard. So we'll move next into column 8 here with Safi Arik's daughter. Unfortunately, I believe this card is about 50% bugged, and what I mean by that is half the time it works, half the time it unfortunately doesn't right now. But if you're unfamiliar with Safi, what she essentially does for you is you sacrifice her, and whenever a creature that you target with her dies this turn or goes to your graveyard, it comes back into play. With all these recurring or all these ETB effects, you'd find her to be an all-star if she works right on Moto. Den Protector, this card I question. Very powerful card, lower synergy with this style of deck, just due to the fact that it itself can't be recursed from the graveyard and have an immediate effect on the battlefield because it's not morphed then. What we're really looking for in this card is a secondary Eternal Witness, which is really an all-star in pretty much any deck it's in, but in this deck it shines. If you're able to recurse this multiple times out of the graveyard, you get so much value out of it because you're able to buy back your actual literal spells and your tutor effects, which we'll cover at the tail end of this. But Den Protector gives you an additional option to do that. You're only going to get to do that once, unfortunately. Sun Titan, a powerhouse. There are 2 Titans in this deck. Probably one of the more broken cycles that WotC has ever printed to have them come out. But this card's an all-star. There are so many creatures in here. I mean, Eternal Witness for one, Safi again, Recurring Nightmare. For some reason, you ditch it with Grimflayer itself, and then anything we've already really covered along the curve, as well as some of the stuff we'll cover in the tutoring effects. Karmic Guide. So this card itself combines with this big fellow right here, Protean Hulk, in quite a synergistic way. Karmic Guide essentially says pay 5 mana and put anything in your graveyard into play for free, and have a free 2/2 flying blocker for 1 whole turn. You're never going to pay the echo on this thing. One, getting dual white is sometimes tough in the deck. And 2, you don't want it in play. You want to bring it back and continue to bring creatures back every turn, when you're recurring Karmic Guide. With effects like Recurring Nightmare, it combines out very well with Revelark. So Recurring Nightmare, if you're unfamiliar with the card, and really it's the other part of the namesake of the deck. Recurring Nightmare basically says sacrifice a creature, return Recurring Nightmare itself to your hand, and then return another creature from any creature from your graveyard into play. What this means with all these enters the battlefield effects is that you essentially can recycle enter the battlefield effects 3, 4, 5 times, which can get quite silly with cards like Primeval Titan or Protean Hulk or Sidisi, which is a tutor itself. Really, it's kind of a crazy card once you do get this into play. It ends games very rapidly if you have enough mana to activate it twice in a turn. The other benefit to it is it's really untargetable. Unless you're playing this and then attacking your opponent or giving any handoffs in priority to them, then they could interact with it. But if you're playing it, using it, there's really no way to get rid of it other than discard from your hands. It's a very powerful card. Living Death, if you're not familiar with this, it basically says sacrifice all the creatures. Each player sacrifices all of them, and then everything in their graveyard comes back into play. And thus the interaction with Bajuka Bog on your opponent being a powerful one. And then Revelark, this card says, hey, I'm going to give you a good body, a 4/3 flyer, and opponent, if you want to kill this thing and it's going to go to the graveyard, then I'm going to bring back 2 creatures that have power 2 or less, which means Karmic Guide and really anything you've managed to get into your graveyard. Could be anything from a Protean Hulk to, a Birds of Paradise off of this. And then Revelark itself will bring back anything with 2 power. And because Grimflayer is not going to be a 4/4 inside the graveyard, it's not on the battlefield, you could bring Grimflayer back as a 4/4 Tarmogoyf. Obviously, when it's in the graveyard, its power is star, it's 0. So you can bring this thing back, and it can get as big as a 7/8 inside this deck. Same thing with Sylvan Advocate. It's only a 2/3 in there, but it could come back and give you a power swing of 8 to even 10 with all the man lands, plus the +2/+2 bonus it gets when it comes onto the battlefield. So very powerful card, Revelark is. And really it combines out nicely with Safi, which can just do shenanigans with it. Obviously, bounce it and rebounce it back into play multiple times. And you can see the obvious inclusion of Phyrexian Tower giving you some benefit to that. So before we move on, a couple cards that have not been included that are probably worth talking about. I think some players would take this deck design and go in a direction of Miriak Life. Correction. I can't remember her name. I think it's Miria Life. I can't remember her name, but the card that essentially is a 2/2 bear that says you can't get poison counters and your creatures can't have -1 counters. And it was essentially the basis. Malira is the card's name. It was essentially the basis of a modern deck that eventually got pod banned, which we'll get to in a minute. Is in this deck. Combined out with Kitchen Finks to give infinite life. Combined out with the card escapes me. Red Cap, Murderous Red Cap, and then a sack outlet at the 1-drop, which you could use numerous cards for that cost no mana, essentially to sacrifice a creature for a scry effect or a +1/+1 counter. The problem I ran into with those cards in testing is that often they're dead. It's a great combo. The combo at this point, I believe, is turned to Archangel of Thune and then Spike Feeder, which is also a powerful combo. But in Singleton, cards are often just dead, and they don't have ETBs that immediately impact the board. So with the tutor package we have, you could likely find it. It's very easily disruptible, and it doesn't generate value in and of itself. So I've tended to avoid that in this build because I think it's good, but I think this is just frankly better. What's going on here, because every card in and of itself has its own impact. It allows you to play a value-based mid-range game, or in the matchups where it's safe to do so, transition to a more unfair combo-based strategy because your opponent's just not playing a deck that can interact on that level with it. As you move over, we start jumping into our tutor package. This is the critter-based tutor package right here. Secure a Tribe Elder. Very powerful card. As we said, we do have 4 basics in the deck. It combos out very nicely with cards like Pattern of Rebirth, which essentially says Natural Order on it for the same converted mana cost, but the creature that is on has to die. So you cannot sacrifice it like Natural Order. It has to be put on a creature, and then that creature has to die. Obviously, more risk associated with that, but when you have cards like your Tribe Elder, other sack outlets, or sacrifice outlets inside the deck, you're able to do that pretty easily. And this is one of the cards that really combos out well with that. Moving on, you have Nissa, Vastwood Seer, newer card. This card right here is great. 2 forests inside the deck. Very easy to flip if you want to start getting value off drawing more cards, or throw 4/4s on the board to sacrifice to Recurring Nightmare or just block. You can do that. Wood Elves, very, very powerful card. Finds all kinds of mana fixing, can find every color of mana inside the deck. Gives you a 1/1 blocker, and or trades up very well on Birthing for any of the 4 drops inside the deck, to include things like Siege Rhino, which take your 1/1 that gave you a land and give you a 4/5 trampler that gives you 3 life and takes away 3 of the opponents. Yavimaya Dryad, very powerful card in the current meta. A little tougher to cast than Wood Elves. The land does come into play tapped, which is obviously a detriment to the card in comparison to Wood Elves. Larger body, though, so you have a 2/1 Forest Walk. A lot of mono green players out there right now, so the Forest Walk is not irrelevant, and getting a couple attacks in with it before you sacrifice it to get something better is a thing that I've found. Knight of the Reliquary, powerhouse. Tutors for you in a 100-card format. That's great. We do obviously have the Thespian Stage Dark Depths combo. It can help you find that, although I've found that it's generally not going to find it for you. Primeval Titan generally will, because it's slower to do so. Just a great mid-range threat that can tutor and find a lot of options inside your lands, especially given the utility of all our lands that we have. Fauna Shaman, similar thing. The fixed version of Survival of the Fittest. You can only do it once a turn. You can't mill through your deck and make a huge living death anymore. But this card's great. If it survives a turn, it can generally dominate games, or whatever you get with it will dominate the game. Academy Rector, great card. Very broken. Obviously, in some decks, it's more broken than it is here. But 9 times out of 10, what it's finding, unless you've already found it, is going to be your recurring nightmare, because the card's just that good. The cool thing about it is you can dump this onto the board as a mid-range card to hold the opponent's creatures back or force them to commit more to the board or get wider, and then Living Death right over the top of it, and you don't really care to lose it. Obviously, there's no recursion with this because it exiles when you go to find something, but once you have Recurring Nightmare, I have yet to see a game lost once Recurring Nightmares hit the board with this deck. Sidisi, another newer ad. Sidisi, great card. One, it allows you to get after the recursion with your graveyard because you get to dump great enter the battlefield effects creatures into your graveyard. And, once you've done that, you get to go find Recurring Nightmare and start doing more of it. Same with Living Death. So the counter for this are also going to be Recurring Nightmare and Living Death. Moving on, Primetime. Really the biggest earner of this deck I've found. Like I said, he comes into play, and you essentially have just got an investment. 4 mana and 1 useless creature off Natural Order or Pattern of Rebirth to get him, and you get 26 worth of power and toughness on the board. Both of it, I wouldn't say evasive, but both of it can get through pretty easily because you have 20/20 that's flying and indestructible, and you have the 6/6 trample, which is just a great body. Protean Hulk, another great one in this deck. And actually, I just posted a matchup that maybe you got a chance to look at, where this card essentially single-handedly beat 2 Eldrazi swings at this deck, by Emrakul of the Aeon's Torn, and then the other one's name escapes me, but it's the 4/4 Annihilator that destroys and comes into play. Kozilek, I think. But this card essentially, once it was in play, an Emrakul swing, all that means is a Karmic Guide plus this, plus 3 combined power of other creatures, which, keep in mind, Dryad Arbor is free off of this thing, so if you don't already have it in play or it's not already in the graveyard, it's a freebie. If you could play infinite Dryad Arbors, this thing can find infinite of them. Thus, the reason that it got Flash banned at one point, or still to this day, it's restricted in Vintage and banned in most formats because Protean Hulk plus Flash was an infinite combo with some crazy combination of shifting walls and artifact sacrifice cards that cause damage at one point in time. Kind of a cheesy deck, but this guy is a true earner. He will always bring himself back into play off of Karmic Guide plus any other combination of cards you want to find. And generally, if that's not enough, the second time you use a Protean Hulk on your opponent, I've yet to see anyone win that. Like I said, I've had a player swing 2 Eldrazi at me and still, just because this card is that good. Once that's happening. All right, so the non-critter based tutors on the far side here. You have Worldly Tutor, obviously a powerful card. You're down a card off of it, but honestly, if you're finding the right creature for the matchup that you're in, and the timing of the matchup you're in, it's well worth it. Traverse the Ulvenwald. Very easy to get Delirium in this deck, and this is a 1-mana tutor for any land, which, remember, we do run man lands, and we do have land combos inside this deck, and or creature, and it goes right in your hand. Nature's Lore, another possibly questionable one, but I'm always worried about mana fixing. This allows you to really get after it, and it's a great effect. It's coming in untapped. It's 2 mana, and you're going to 4 mana on turn 3. Good effect. Miri's Guile. So there are a lot of tutors, which equate to a lot of shuffle effects inside this deck. This is essentially a poor man's Sensei's Divining Top in this deck because it's currently banned in the 100S format. But with the volume of shuffle effects, this card may seem a little out of theme, but I found it to be phenomenal because you have a lot of one-punch knockout cards that if you find, you just pretty much win. And if you don't, you find another way to shuffle the deck or generate value off of your creatures in the meantime. Sylvan Library, a similar idea, although far stronger, more powerful card than Miri's Guile. You can pull them off the top, and often you want to because this deck can gain a lot of life. So you'll find that it's well worth being very aggressive with Sylvan Library. Just some of it's matchup dependent. Against control, you almost draw every turn. You obviously need to gain life at some point, but you want to be very aggressive with it. Crop rotation. Again, free land tutor. I find it's great wasteland or acidic slime insurance as well. But it'll just find you the right land at the right time. Whether that's, you've managed to build a good mid-range army up and you want to find Gaia's Cradle to hard cast a Woodfall Primus or a Primeval Titan or a Protean Hulk, or you want to find another piece to a combo or another threat in one of your man lands. It's just a stellar card. Enlightened Tutor, similar idea, finds Recurring Nightmare most commonly, can find Courser Crew Fix, but your typical target is going to be Recurring Nightmare. As you can see, there's a lot of a recurring theme, if you will, of means to find Recurring Nightmare is the card really is the powerhouse of the deck and the namesake of it. Evolutionary Leap, not even remotely survival of the fittest. However, it does put creatures in your graveyard, and it does put another card in your hand. So for this deck, that really is a form of card advantage, unless your opponent has an active means of exiling cards from your graveyard, because this deck has so many means to interact with the graveyard. The next is Sterling Grove. So this is another questionable one, but one I thought was a very valuable add to the deck. It is a top tutor. It is not instant speed. It will likely find Recurring Nightmare. The value of this card really comes when you start looking at the sideboard. So because of the ability of it to interact favorably with some of the cards in our sideboard, which I'll cover in a moment, I thought it was well worth the ad. Plus, it also just gets Recurring Nightmare in the right matchups. It can get Courser Crew Fix. It could get Bitter Blossom if you wanted to. About in probably that order of precedence. But just a very flexible card, and what it allows us to do with our sideboard options is very powerful. So that's why it has been included in the deck. Elmary's Call. One creature, instant speed into hand, green and a white. Enough said. Great card. Just powerful tutor in these colors. Diabolic Intent. Any card in my deck at sorcery speed, I have to sacrifice a creature. Well, normally that would be, a detriment, but in this deck, typically you want to. Some of your creatures are even actively better when you do sacrifice them. Reference Protean Hulk, reference Revelark, reference any creature with a Safi trigger on it, and I think you see my point. Just a very powerful and flexible card. Birthing Pod, a powerhouse in this format. And this deck can walk up the curve to 8 mana. Some of the dangers you run with Birthing Pod, and another card of note that is not included in this would be Hermit Druid. But one of the issues you run into with Birthing Pod is sometimes you can break chains. So at the end of this, I'll organize the deck by casting cost, so you can kind of see what the curve looks like. There is the ability to break the chain, either due to drawing certain creature cards, discarding certain creature cards, and due to that risk, I have cut Hermit Druid, because this is really not a straight Reanimator deck, which is really where I think Hermit Druid shines. Very powerful card. It would work very well to self-mill in this deck, but it has a lot of anti-synergies with some cards. So really what you're looking for is to control that which it is you put in your graveyard, that which you manage in your hand, and that which you keep in the library. There are sometimes best worst top decks when you're playing this deck where you wanted a Birthing Pod for a certain creature, for instance, a Shriek Maw or a Bone Shredder, and that effect just happens to pop in your hand and your mana is not fixed to cast it, or something along those lines. So that's why Hermit Druid's not in here. But Birthing Pod, stellar card. You can walk the curve of value. And like I said, there's a lot of cards that don't die. They persist, or they come back, or they set up graveyard shenanigans based off sacrificing them. So it has numerous synergies. Eldritch Evolution. This is essentially a quote-unquote fixed version of Natural Order. You only go two slots up the curve on it, but it is one less mana. Also sacrifices, but like we said, we want to sacrifice in this deck, and the tutoring effect and the instantly putting into play effect is great. It's essentially a third Natural Order in this deck. The second natural order in this deck would be Pattern of Rebirth. Like I said, because we sacrifice so many things in this deck, this often operates the same as natural order. It is a bit more of a risky card. Cards like Swords to Plowshares, Path to Exile, or exiling effects exist. So when you're casting this, you want to be cognizant of what your opponent is playing, and then what mana is available, what availability you have to sacrifice the creature on the spot. Because if you leave this on a creature long enough, I think you can expect your opponent to bounce it, to exile it, etc. And it's just 4 mana down the drain. So you want to have a plan when you're using this. You don't want to just throw it on a creature willy-nilly and hope it dies in combat, because your opponent's probably smart enough not to trade in that way. They'll probably just take the damage or not attack you. Natural Order, the card's an all-star. I know a lot of folks are clamoring to ban it. I really hope we don't. It's a very exciting and fun card to play, I think, for everyone. Sometimes it's oppressive to play against, but I think it is a decently fair effect for the format. It is a build around. It is narrow in the context that it only gets green creatures, which we have built around to support in this deck right here. And typically speaking, sacrificing a creature would be a detriment. We built in the way that it's not in this deck. It's generally beneficial. Court of Calling, great card. Now, I found this is probably one of the weaker of the creature tutors. Really, it's just due to the 3 green mana sources. We run a ton of green creatures, but like I said, it's not very often that we have a ton of creatures in play, and by the time we do, we're already winning. So in a lot of ways, the flexibility this offers you tends to be on the lower end of the curve. You're generally trying to find, a 2 or a 3 drop that can fix mana or ramp you a little bit, and then get to more important business spells. That's just how I found the card plays out in this deck. Green Sun Zenith, very powerful. The deck can make a ton of mana. You can use it late game. You can use it early game. I often find that it's a good early to mid game card that you're using. You're not generally casting it for 7 or 8 drops. I just haven't had it come up. It's definitely possible, but by that point in the game, if you've gotten to that point in the game and not closed it down, you're likely playing against control, and there's going to be mana open. So, I mean, I think you often want to fire cards like Green Sun Zenith off for that mid-range threat that forces their hand early. Because, like I said, I mean, if you're in the late portion of the game with this deck, you're probably playing control because you're going to close mid-range games out quickly. It just goes over the top of them. You're going to close aggro games out quickly. You can gain tons of life and just put better and bigger creatures into play. So that really kind of transitions well into the sideboard. So my theory on sideboarding in general is that you shouldn't sideboard or build sideboards that benefit you more in the game plan that you're currently good at. You should utilize sideboards to really exploit weaknesses in the matchups that you're bad at. So what does this deck lose to? In my experience, really what this deck can lose to is control. In the 2 cards, and I kind of referenced them already, that you're really worried about are Humility, Moat to a lesser extent, and then Aven Mind Sensor, or anything that really stops you from tutoring. Because this deck loves to search. Like I said, 25 main deck tutor effects, not including fetch lands, which take you up to about 30. So if you go through the sideboard, we have 1 land. Homeward Path, great card for this deck. Generally, I'll side up to 40 lands. It's not a bad thing for the deck because it can put a lot of land into play real fast, really thin out the deck and increase virtual card advantage of your top decks. And this card is just an all-star against control decks that run cards like Bribery, Treachery, Control Magic Effects, Shackles, etc. So the card's just very, very powerful. One additional option you could look at doing in the color pie that we're in for this to combat that, if that was a concern for you, would be a Brooding Saurian, 4 CMC card, 2 green and 2 other, 4/4, decent mid-range beater. That upon the trigger of every upkeep, everyone regains control of their own cards. I don't think that's really necessary for this deck because the deck itself is not truly. It's not truly a natural order deck. Natural order benefits what it's doing, but it's really more of a high synergy deck. So I've played a game, and I did eventually lose it, where my opponent treacheryed me 3 times through recursion of an Eternal Witness. correction, I'm sorry, bribery me 3 times through recursion of eternal witness. And while they were able to get a Protean Hulk, a Sun Titan, really because the cards are high synergy and they're meant to work well together, they weren't able to do much impressive with it. Now they did eventually win, but the game went on for about 10 turns, which I think after being briberied 3 times, you would expect it to be much shorter than that. So I don't really think you need more effects than Homeward Path, and because of the ability of this deck to find land very easily, the right lands very easily, that's generally enough. And if someone wastelands it, you have a lot of land recursion as well, so you can bring it back to your benefit. Now here we get into some more of the more interesting ones. Nature's Claim. So this seems like a fairly innocuous card, an odd card to have in a sideboard. Really why it's here is because it's very efficient. They'll gain some life, but frankly, the decks we're playing this card against, we don't really care if they gain life. Really, life gain's not a problem for this deck. You're not generally racing. It's an attrition deck. It just outvalues pretty much everything on the street. What this card's in here specifically for is it is a non-creature based means of removing enchantments. Like I said, we're typically worried about opponents' enchantments, specifically humility. And because we only have one main deck way once humility has been resolved to deal with it, which would be our Dromoka's command, we want to be able to sideboard into greater options for it because, like we run Enlightened Tutor, a lot of control decks will as well to find some of their more powerful enchantments like humility to stop decks that run into a strategy like this. Guttural Response, generally just a good spell to fight counter magic, so it's been included in here. Fairly flexible spell for those matchups because, like we said, this deck, where it is less advantaged is against control. Autumn's Veil, similar, with an added effect of your creatures being unable to be removed the turn that it is cast. This card is actually, I think, more flexible than Guttural Response, just due to the fact that you're able to fall or essentially dispel a removal card that's on the stack once you cast it. So very powerful. All right, Graveyard Shenanigans. Yeah, we're doing it, but we're hypocrites. So we have Scavenging Ooze here, which is a great mid-range beater, gains you some life, good against aggro. And generally okay against control, but where this card really shines is other decks that utilize the graveyard as a continuous form of resource. It's just great at it. So you'll have lots of mana. Green being the base color, you'll generally have mostly green mana. Card's just phenomenal in that matchup. Similar theory here, Hallowed Moonlight. So again, we're hypocrites. This card right here answers a lot of different power cards, whether it be Natural Order, whether it be Pattern of Rebirth, which I don't see a lot of other people play, or whether it just be plain old Reanimator effects, or Show and Tell, Sneak Attack. There's a lot of ways to cheat big, silly things into play, and this pretty much just ends it all. Because it's an instant and because it's only for one turn, generally I find that if you fog them on the right turn from doing such things, or you exile 1 or 2 creatures that way, it just ends their game plan because you don't need this effect to be continuous, really just to get an Emrakul of the Aeon's Torn, removed from the game once is generally going to be game breaking because generally decks that are doing something like that have to expend a lot of cards and resources to get to a point where they can win. So if you're able to, just, push them just a little bit, you can generally just turn the corner and win the game very easily. All right, so same is true of Containment Priest. Containment Priest, I'll bring in for similar matchups. The greatness of this card is like I said, we can play mid-range if we want. Or, if we get ahead, we can just ensure our position by holding this card in the hand, and then when the opponent tries to bring in a Craterhoof Behemoth, or when they try to reanimate, something that is going to end our game plan, like an Elesh Norn, we can just toss this down and swing in for the win. So this is just a great card a very flexible card against those kind of decks. And like I said, we don't have to reanimate. We can just play a simple mid-range game, and this card right here, until it's removed, can just lock up the game. Compost, this probably needs to get changed out for something different. Really, it's a meta call. So we do have a player inside the meta right now who is typically on black zombies. So this was just a meta call. Similar really to the Hallowed Moonlight Scavenging Ooze and Containment Priest, because there's also a reanimator play in the current meta that we have. So some of the sideboard's a little techy, but could definitely be played with depending on which meta you intend on playing in. City of Solitude, great control card. So jumping back to the kind of odd choice in Sterling Grove, this is part of the Sterling Grove package, really. So once I've sideboarded, outside of Recurring Nightmare, I have cards such as City of Solitude, which essentially says you can't counter anything. Matter of fact, you can't even play spells and or abilities of your creatures on my turn. Keep in mind, you can't either, so if you're looking at using cards like Deathrite Shaman or any of your mana critters, it's not going to work, because it does include mana abilities as well. So keep that in mind when you play it. Croson Grip, also part of an uncounterable set of actual spells to get rid of Humility itself, because that card wrecks you. Dosen, the Fallen Leaf. This card is questionable. It's another counterspell measure. It basically just says, hey, opponent, you're not casting spells on my turn. I don't know on this one. It's a 2/2 body for 3 mana. Legendary, which means that it's weak to Karakas, but we could also bounce it with our own Karakas. This one is temporary. I'm not a huge fan of it, but it's an additional, essentially, City of Solitude effect that helps shore up your matchup against control. All right, Great Sable Stag. Hey, can't be countered. 3/3 body, protection, blue and black. Like I said, there's a almost mono black player in the meta, and there are a couple control players that circulate through the meta. This card's just a fine mid-range card that allows you to get a 3/3 body, recurring source of damage down if the opponent wants to counter everything you play. Hey, Witchstalker, same thing. This one is even better once it hits the board because it has hexproof, because generally speaking, blue-black is not a thing I see all that often, or I see black as a supporting color to blue-white as primary colors. All right, Aura Shards. This card is a beast. So this is the real reason, in addition to City of Solitude, that we run Sterling Grove. This card says anytime we put a creature into play, which, keep in mind, close to half the deck is creatures, and it doesn't even count lands, which, being fair, don't count for Aura Shards either. But Aura Shard says anytime you put a creature into play, you can destroy an artifact or enchantment. So imagine how silly the opponent feels when they play Humility or Moat or any other oppressive enchantment towards critters, and you play this thing and just throw a Dryad Arbor on the board, and their 4 or 5 mana enchantment is just gone. Phenomenal card, great to protect against cards that specifically hose this deck. All right, Anna Fenza, the last one. Honestly, she could almost go main because she is just a great mid-range beater in general, and she shores up Reanimator matchups for us. And the benefit of this card is it doesn't hurt our own graveyard shenanigans. So she has a lot of positive synergy with cards like Living Death, Living Death specifically, because the opponent's creatures, when they die, will just get exiled, and then yours will go to the graveyard, and then when you Living Death, the opponent gets nothing, and you get everything. So, very strong card. I hope you enjoyed my quick deck tech. Hope if this is a format that interests you, this is a deck you'll give a try to. Very fun deck, very powerful deck, a little bit pricey, and if you're interested in some lower cost options to build a deck very similar to this, but in a similar power level as well, please shoot me an email or put a comment up in MTG Salvation, and I'd be more than willing to share some of my ideas with this deck and how it can be built on more of a budget. Thank you, and take care.